A whisper slices the hush of first class. They should sit in the back. Two young CEOs, Ava and Arya Coleman, look up. A smile that is not a smile waits across the aisle. In this cabin of quiet privilege, who decides who belongs? What is a seat worth when dignity is on the line? How far will entitlement go when it is told no? And what happens when a single phone call answers with power, with love, with a promise that justice will be heard at 30,000 feet? This is not just a flight. It is a test of character, of courage, of culture. Will calm strength hold when insult turns cruel? Will truth stand when the room stays silent? Stay with us and listen closely. The sky is about to change. If this story moves you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell the stories that matter. Now, let us begin. The terminal at JFK buzzed with its usual symphony of motion. Rolling suitcases clicked across polished floors. Boarding announcements echoed like background music. Travelers with weary eyes hurried toward their gates, chasing connections, chasing dreams. But inside Gate A17, where Aurora Airlines was preparing its overnight flight to Paris, there was a different energy, something hushed, refined, and almost theatrical. This was first class. Ava Coleman adjusted the strap of her sleek leather carry-on as she and her sister, Arya, handed their boarding passes to the attendant. The scanner beeped softly, confirming their entry. The attendant smiled, almost bowing, as if she knew these two women were not just passengers. They were something more. Ava walked with the steady grace of someone used to balancing poise and pressure. Her dark brown skin glowed under the warm airport lights, and the tailored cream blazer she wore seemed almost sculpted to her frame. She wasn't flashy. Her elegance was quiet, deliberate, commanding. Beside her, Arya carried the same physical beauty. They were identical twins after all, but her energy was different. Arya's stride was quick, shoulders squared, eyes sharp as though she were always ready to challenge the world if it dared to underestimate her. The two of them had built something remarkable together. At 25, they were already co-founders of Lumina, a financial education startup designed to help underserved communities understand money in a world that often tried to shut them out. Their app had gone viral. Investors were circling, and in Paris, they had been invited to keynote the Global Tech Futures Summit. For two young black women who had spent their lives fighting to prove they belonged, this wasn't just a trip, it was a milestone. Inside the jet bridge, the smell of fresh upholstery and recycled air mixed with the faint tang of aviation fuel. Arya nudged her sister. "Can you believe we're about to do this, Paris? Our faces on that stage." Ava smiled softly, adjusting her gold cuff bracelet. "We worked for this, Arya. We didn't just stumble into it." The flight attendant at the door of the Airbus A350 greeted them warmly. "Welcome aboard. Miss Coleman, Miss Coleman. First class is straight ahead, to your left." They stepped into a world that seemed suspended above the chaos of the airport. First class wasn't just a cabin. It was another universe. Wide leather seats stretched into pods with privacy walls. Each pod gleamed with polished accents, large screens, and space enough to stretch out like royalty. The soft glow of ambient lighting washed everything in calming blues and golds. The sisters found their seats 1A and 1B, side by side at the very front. Ava ran her hand over the seat's fabric, savoring the small victory. "You know," she whispered, "Mom and Dad would have loved to see this. Us here. Not as guests, not as exceptions, but because we earned it." Arya grinned, sinking into her seat with exaggerated comfort. Earning it never looked this good. A flight attendant appeared with a tray of champagne. Ava declined politely. She wanted a clear head for the long flight. Arya accepted, raising her glass playfully. To Lumina. To Paris. To finally being seen. They clinked glasses, their bond as sisters evident in every mirrored gesture. The cabin filled slowly, men in tailored suits, a couple draped in designer scarves, a silver-haired author who immediately pulled out a Mont Blanc pen. Everyone had an aura of wealth or influence, but Ava and Arya carried something rarer purpose. They weren't here to flaunt privilege. They were here to claim a place they had built with sweat and brilliance. Yet even in this cocoon of privilege, there was a subtle undercurrent. Arya noticed the way some passengers' eyes lingered just a little longer on them. Not the admiring look people sometimes gave twins. No, this was different. A measuring glance. A quiet calculation. Do they belong here? Ava noticed too. She always did. But she steadied her breath. This was not the first time their presence in rarefied spaces had been questioned. It wouldn't be the last. She pressed her lips into a calm line. "Ignore it," she murmured to her sister. "We've got a bigger stage ahead." Arya nodded, but her jaw was tight. She had always been the fire to Ava's water, the one who bristled when they were treated as less than. Sometimes she envied her sister's calm. Other times, she wondered if that calm cost too much. The plane's doors closed with a solid thud, sealing them into a pressurized capsule that would soon be flying 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and practiced, promising a safe and restful journey. The sisters settled in, pulling out tablets to review their keynote one last time. Everything was perfect, or it should have been. But as Ava glanced across the aisle, she noticed a woman settling into seat 1C, platinum hair, styled into a stiff helmet, a necklace of heavy gold links, an aura of wealth that wasn't quiet at all, but loud, almost performative. She was joined moments later by a man in 1D, her husband, judging by the way she patted his hand. The woman glanced at Ava and Arya, her lips tightening just slightly. She leaned toward her husband and whispered. But the words carried in the intimate quiet of first class. "They should sit in the back. These seats should go to people who paid for them properly." The sentence sliced through the air like a cold blade. Arya froze, her nails pressing into the armrest. Ava's chest tightened, though her face betrayed nothing. Around them, silence pressed in. A few passengers pretended not to hear. Others shifted uncomfortably. It was the kind of moment they both knew too well, a moment where dignity was tested, where silence could feel like survival, but also like surrender. Ava stared straight ahead, her voice quiet, almost inaudible. Not now. Not yet. Arya swallowed hard, fire burning in her chest. "But how long do we keep letting them?" "Arya?" Ava interrupted gently, her hand brushing her sister's arm. "We'll handle it. Just not yet." But even as she said it, Ava felt the weight of the words sink like a stone. They had earned these seats. They had earned this moment. And already, someone was trying to take it away. What neither of them knew then was that this would not remain just a whisper. Within hours, it would ignite into something larger, something that would shake the cabin, the airline, and the lives of everyone involved. For now, though. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, and the sisters braced themselves, not just for the flight, but for the storm they could already feel gathering in the air. The engines roared softly beneath them as the massive Airbus A350 pushed back from the gate. The vibration was steady, almost soothing, Overhead bins clicked shut. Cabin lights dimmed to a gentle glow. A flight attendant glided down the aisle, double-checking seat belts with a practiced smile. On the surface, everything was routine. But Ava and Arya Coleman knew the flight would be anything but ordinary. The words were still hanging in the air, sharp and poisonous. They should sit in the back. Ava kept her gaze on the screen in front of her, pretending to scroll through the safety information, though every syllable of that whisper replayed in her mind. Arya, meanwhile, fidgeted with her seatbelt clasp, her jaw tight as if grinding down the rage that was already rising inside her. Margaret Whitmore sat directly across from them in 1C. Her husband, Charles, was at her side in 1D, already flipping through a leather-bound legal brief. Margaret smoothed the hem of her designer jacket, oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent to the quiet discomfort she had created around her. A couple of rows back, a businessman sipped his champagne, trying not to look. A young woman with earbuds stole a glance at the twins, then looked away quickly. Arya leaned toward her sister. Her voice was low, controlled, but laced with fury. "Did you hear her? I heard," Ava replied, her tone steady. She didn't even try to hide it. She wanted us to hear. Ava pressed her lips together. "That's the point. It was meant to cut." Arya's chest heaved, her fingers curling into fists. "I'm not just going to sit here and let her." Ava placed a hand on her arm, squeezing gently. "Not yet. We don't need to start something before we even take off." The seatbelt sign chimed. The plane gathered speed, engines surging, pressing everyone into their seats as it climbed toward the night sky. Outside the window, New York glittered for a brief moment before disappearing into the darkness. But inside, the atmosphere was heavier than the Atlantic clouds they pierced through. As soon as the cabin leveled out and the attendants began preparing for service, Margaret leaned slightly forward in her seat. She spoke to her husband, but her words were aimed like darts toward Ava and Arya. "I don't understand how the airline makes these mistakes," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "mixing certain passengers into first class. It diminishes the experience. Don't you think?" Charles murmured something inaudible, not looking up from his papers. Margaret took his silence as agreement. Arya's nails dug into her palm. She could feel the blood rushing in her ears. She imagined standing up, confronting the woman with every ounce of fury she had bottled over the years. She imagined the looks on the other passengers' faces when truth scorched through the cabin, but Ava's calm presence beside her was like an anchor. She forced herself to stay seated, though every muscle in her body wanted to rebel. Moments later, the soft shuffle of polished shoes stopped beside their row. It was Kevin Turner, the young attendant, his face pale and nervous. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ladies. May I have a word?" Ava and Arya looked up. Kevin shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Margaret before leaning slightly closer. "There's been a request. Mrs. Whitmore." He hesitated. "She's asked if you would be willing to switch seats. She'd like to sit next to her husband for the flight." Arya's eyes widened, disbelief flashing like lightning. "You can't be serious." Kevin's voice faltered. "It's just a request. She's a valued passenger, a Platinum Elite member. We're hoping stop." Ava's tone was soft but firm, cutting through his fumbling explanation. "These seats were booked months ago, paid in full, confirmed. We're not moving." Kevin swallowed. "I understand. Truly. But Mrs. Whitmore is insistent. I can offer you each a voucher, $500. You'd still have business class, which is not what we paid for." Arya snapped. Her voice carried further than she intended, and a few heads turned. She didn't care. You're asking us to downgrade so she can feel comfortable. No, absolutely not. Kevin's cheeks flushed. Please, keep your voices down. I'm just trying to do your job, Arya shot back. Because right now, your job seems to be protecting her comfort at the expense of ours. Ava reached over, resting her hand on her sister's arm again. Her gaze locked on Kevin, unwavering. We appreciate your position, but the answer is no. We will not move. Kevin opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked back toward Margaret, who was watching with a smirk tugging at her lips. Then he nodded stiffly. I'll let the supervisor know. When he walked away, Arya exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Can you believe this? It's happening again. Different setting, same story. Ava didn't answer immediately. She stared at the flickering seatbelt sign above them, her mind racing. How many times had they fought to claim space they had earned? How many times had silence been easier, but dignity demanded otherwise? She felt the old ache stir inside her, a mix of exhaustion and defiance. She finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper. This isn't about seats. It's about what people think we deserve. Arya turned to her, her eyes burning. Then let's show them exactly what we deserve. The cabin service began. Ellen Brooks, the senior attendant, approached with the grace of authority. Her smile was professional, her tone polished, but there was a tightness in her eyes. Good evening, Miss Coleman. Miss Coleman, I understand there's been some confusion. There's no confusion, Arya said flatly. We're in the seats we paid for. Ellen nodded carefully. Yes, you are, and your reservations are confirmed. Oh, however, Mrs. Whitmore has expressed distress at being separated from her husband. In situations like this, we sometimes ask passengers if they would consider switching. It's entirely voluntary, of course. Voluntary, Arya scoffed. It doesn't feel voluntary when you keep sending people over to pressure us. Ellen's expression flickered, but she maintained composure. I understand how it may feel. I assure you, no one can force you to move. But if you are open to it, we can compensate you. Ava met her gaze. Calm, steady. We're not open to it. Please respect that. For a moment, Ellen's mask slipped. Relief flickered across her face, as if part of her had hoped they would stand firm. She nodded. Understood. But Margaret wasn't finished. From across the aisle, her voice cut through the hum of the cabin. This is ridiculous. I've been flying with this airline for 20 years. I spend more on tickets in a month than those girls make in a year, and you're telling me you can't move them. The word girls landed like a slap. Arya's fist clenched. Eva felt her heartbeat thud in her ears. Ellen's voice sharpened. Mrs. Whitmore, please lower your voice. But Margaret only leaned forward, her words dripping with venom. Let's be honest, Ellen. They're probably here because of some diversity program, a photo op for your marketing department. Meanwhile, real loyal customers are treated like dirt. The cabin fell into stunned silence. Every passenger had heard it now. The mask was off. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her calm cracked, just slightly, under the weight of the insult. She saw Arya's eyes ignite, the fury she had been holding back now impossible to contain. A storm was no longer just gathering. It had broken. And Ava knew, with chilling certainty, that this flight would end very differently than it began. The cabin of Aurora Airlines' flagship jet seemed to shrink as Margaret Whitmore's words echoed through the air. For a moment, no one moved. The flight attendants froze mid-step. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their wide leather seats, and even the hum of the engine seemed to recede under the weight of her venom. Arya Coleman's jaw tightened. Her fists balled against the armrest. Ava Coleman sat impossibly still, though her chest rose and fell in a rhythm that betrayed the fire she kept locked behind her calm facade. Margaret wasn't finished. Her eyes narrowed as she fixed them on the sisters. She leaned forward in her seat, the heavy perfume she wore drifting across the aisle like a warning cloud. "Look at them," she said, her voice pitched high enough for every passenger in first class to hear. "Two little girls who think they belong here. This is first class. It's not for charity cases." A hush fell, the kind that pressed down like invisible weight. Charles Whitmore, her husband, finally looked up from his papers. His brows furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. His silence was not disapproval. It was complicity. He smoothed the page in front of him as if the matter did not concern him at all. Arya leaned forward, her eyes burning with a rage that threatened to spill over. "Say that again." Margaret's lips curved into a cold smile. "You heard me?" Before Arya could rise, Ava's hand pressed firmly against her arm. Ava's gaze never wavered from Margaret, her voice low, deliberate. "We paid for these seats. We will not move." Margaret scoffed, turning her attention back to the attendants. "Do you hear this unbelievable? I demand to be seated with my husband. Fix this, or I'll take it to the highest level of your airline." Ellen Brooks, the senior attendant, inhaled slowly, the mask of professionalism drawn tight across her face. "Mrs. Whitmore, as I've explained, these passengers are confirmed in their seats. We cannot force them to move." Margaret's eyes flashed. She jabbed a manicured finger toward Kevin Turner, the young attendant hovering nervously at her side. "Then why was he sent to ask them in the first place? Isn't it your policy to accommodate loyal customers?" Kevin's face burned crimson. He looked down at the carpet, wishing it might swallow him whole. He had never felt the weight of his inexperience more than at this moment. Arya's voice cut through the tension like steel. "Policy doesn't give you the right to shove us aside. We booked these seats. We earned these seats. The only problem here is your sense of entitlement." Gas rippled through the cabin. A man 2 rows back lowered his newspaper to get a clearer view. A woman across the aisle pressed her lips together, torn between disapproval of the noise and sympathy for the young women who refused to shrink. Margaret's face flushed with indignation. Entitlement. "I've flown this airline since before you were born. I've spent more on tickets than your entire startup is worth." She sneered at them, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You think because you started some little app you're suddenly important. You'll learn your place soon enough." Ava felt the sting of the words settle into her chest. She had built Lumina with Arya from the ground up. Every sleepless night, every rejection from investors, every small victory, none of it had been handed to them. And yet, in Margaret's eyes, none of it mattered. Her voice was steady, quiet but firm. "Our place is exactly where we are sitting." Ellen Brooks finally stepped forward, her voice sharper now, as if summoning her authority from deep within. "Mrs. Whitmore, that is enough. If you continue to harass other passengers, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter." "Escalate," Margaret barked a laugh. "To whom? A customer service line?" "Please, I know how this works. You need people like me, people who actually pay for loyalty. Without us, your airline would crumble." The words struck Ellen like blows. She had heard complaints before. She had managed entitled passengers countless times. But this was different. This wasn't just entitlement. This was cruelty weaponized against two women who had done nothing but sit in the seats they rightfully owned. Kevin cleared his throat, his voice shaking. Mrs. Whitmore, please, lower your voice. Other passengers. Don't you dare tell me what to do, Margaret snapped. She turned her glare back on Ava and Arya. This isn't over. Either you move, or I'll make sure the world knows what kind of passengers this airline puts in first class. Arya had reached her limit. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a sharp click and leaned forward, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. The world will know, but not the way you think. Her words carried a weight, a promise of consequences that Margaret clearly did not anticipate. The cabin was no longer just a stage for petty entitlement. It had become an arena where dignity itself was on trial. Ova placed her hand on her sister's wrist, grounding her once more. Her calmness was no longer just restraint. It was strategy. She leaned in close to Arya and whispered, Not yet. Let her bury herself. Margaret caught the whisper and smirked. That's right. Stay quiet. That's what you people are good at. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the rows. Every passenger had heard it. The last thin veil had been torn away. It was no longer about a seat. It was about who was allowed to exist in certain spaces and who was not. Ellen Brooks stood rigid, her professional mask cracking. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice cold. That is absolutely inappropriate. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Bracelets jangling. Spare me your lectures. I know exactly what this is. Diversity quotas. Token gestures. They get their picture taken in first class while the real customers get shoved aside. Tell me I'm wrong. No one answered. Not Ellen, not Kevin, not Charles, who sat frozen in silent complicity. Not the other passengers, who avoided eye contact, unwilling to step into the fire. The silence was suffocating. Ava felt it pressing against her chest, heavier than the cabin air. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shake every witness who sat there, complicit in their silence. But she swallowed her anger, her mind racing. She knew what Arya did not yet realize, that silence could be a weapon too. Arya trembled beside her, fury radiating off her like heat. She whispered, barely holding back. We can't let her get away with this. Not again. Not here. Ava met her gaze, her eyes dark with both pain and resolve. We won't, but we'll choose the moment. And when we do, she'll regret every word. Margaret leaned back in her seat, smugness radiating from her posture. She believed she had won, that her privilege had, once again, reshaped the world around her. But she was wrong. What she didn't know was that she had already set in motion a chain of events that would dismantle not only her comfort, but her world. For Ava and Arya Coleman, the confrontation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady background rhythm that could almost have been calming under different circumstances. But in Aurora Airlines' first-class section, calm was impossible. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken tension. Margaret Whitmore sat across the aisle with her arms folded, lips pinched in indignation, as if the very act of breathing the same air as Ava and Arya Coleman was an injustice. Ellen Brooks, the senior flight attendant, stood poised between the rows. Her expression carried the weight of decades of service, of balancing diplomacy with discipline. But even she looked rattled. Kevin Turner lingered behind her, his youthful nerves visible in every twitch of his hands. Mrs. Whitmore, Ellen began, her tone steady. We have explained that the Coleman seats are confirmed. They are not required to move. We can offer you alternatives." "There are no alternatives." Margaret cut her off. Her voice, sharp as a blade, sliced through the polished calm of first class. "I will not sit apart from my husband. That's non-negotiable." Arya leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Then maybe you should have booked earlier, like everyone else." Gas echoed through the cabin. A man 2 rows back raised his eyebrows, lowering his champagne flute. Margaret's head snapped toward Arya, outrage radiating from her like heat. "How dare you speak to me that way? You children don't understand what it means to be loyal to an airline. My loyalty status is worth more than your little tickets." Arya's fists clenched at her sides. Every nerve in her body screamed to rise, to meet venom with fire. But before she could unleash the storm inside her, Ava's hand found her wrist again. Calm, grounding, deliberate. Ava's voice came next, low and unyielding. "No," she said. The single syllable rang with more authority than a shout. "We are not moving." The refusal landed like a thunderclap. Margaret blinked, stunned that anyone would deny her. Then her face twisted with rage. "Excuse me." Ava's eyes locked onto hers, steady as stone. "We purchased these seats. We confirmed them months ago. They are ours. We are not moving." The silence that followed was electrifying. Arya felt the words ripple through her chest like a current. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself to breathe fully. Ava's calm wasn't surrender. It was defiance, with precision. Margaret sputtered, searching for footing. She turned to Ellen with a dramatic wave of her hand. "Do you hear this? This is insubordination. This is harassment. Are you really going to let this happen? Do you understand who I am?" Ellen inhaled sharply, her patience fraying. "Mrs. Whitmore, please. There is no harassment here. The passengers are in their rightful seats. I must ask you to lower your voice." Margaret's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Lower my voice? When I am being discriminated against. You put them here because of quotas, didn't you? Don't deny it." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Ava felt her chest tighten. Arya shot to her feet, unable to contain herself. "That's enough," she snapped. Her voice reverberated across the cabin, and every passenger was watching now, no longer able to pretend indifference. Her words poured out, fierce and unfiltered. "We're not here because of a quota. We're not here because of charity. We're here because we paid for these seats, because we worked for them. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Her body trembled with the release of the fury she had been holding back. She had lived too many moments like this, moments when her worth was questioned before she even opened her mouth. This time, she would not shrink. Ava rose slowly beside her, her presence a calm counterbalance. She did not raise her voice, but her words carried a weight that silenced even the air. "We are not moving, and no amount of shouting will change that." The twin refusal, one fiery, one steady, shook Margaret more than any insult could have. She looked from one sister to the other, suddenly aware that her dominance was no longer assured. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. But entitlement was a drug she had consumed for decades. And like any addict, she lunged for another dose. "If you don't move, I will see to it that this airline loses me as a customer. Do you know how much money that will cost them?" Kevin Turner shifted uncomfortably. His training told him to placate valuable customers at all costs. But another part of him, the part that remembered the stunned look in Ava's eyes when Margaret spat her venom, hesitated. He swallowed hard and looked at Ellen. silently begging her to take control. Ellen's voice was cooler now, steel hidden beneath silk. "Mrs. Whitmore, threats will not change the fact that these passengers are entitled to their seats. If you continue, I will escalate this matter to the captain." The name of the captain was not just a formality. It was a reminder that Margaret was not the highest authority on this plane. For a moment, Margaret fell silent, lips pressed tightly together. Her husband Charles shifted in his seat, finally speaking. His voice was low, measured. "Margaret, perhaps we should—" "Don't you dare," she snapped, silencing him. "You sit there quietly, as you always do." Charles sank back, his eyes dark with something unspoken fear. Shame, or perhaps the recognition that his wife had already gone too far. Arya crossed her arms, her stance unyielding. "Looks like you're out of options." Margaret's eyes narrowed to slits. "This isn't over," she hissed. Ava sat back down slowly, her composure never faltering. "You're right," she said softly, so softly that only Arya could hear. "It isn't." Arya turned to her sister, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" Ava's gaze drifted toward the window, the clouds a shifting ocean beneath them. "She thinks power means shouting louder. But real power doesn't need to shout. We'll show her when the time is right." Arya exhaled, her anger slowly cooling under the weight of her sister's conviction. She knew that look in Ava's eyes. It meant something was coming, something deliberate. Meanwhile, the rest of the cabin buzzed with unspoken reactions. Some passengers avoided eye contact, ashamed at their silence. Others stared openly, caught between curiosity and unease. A few exchanged subtle nods of approval, though none were brave enough to voice it aloud. Ellen straightened her shoulders, her decision made. She turned to Kevin. "Go to the galley. I'll handle this." Kevin nodded quickly, grateful for the reprieve, and disappeared. Ellen turned back to Margaret, her tone clipped. "Mrs. Whitmore, you will remain in your assigned seat. That is final. If you continue to disrupt, I will have no choice but to involve the captain." Margaret's jaw tightened, her pride was wounded, but she wasn't finished. She leaned back with exaggerated calm, crossing her legs and folding her arms. Her silence was not concession, it was calculation. Ava and Arya exchanged a glance. They knew this was only the beginning. The confrontation had drawn its first battle lines. They had refused. Together. Publicly. Their dignity remained intact, but the storm outside the window was nothing compared to the storm still gathering inside the cabin. And as the plane cut through the night sky toward Paris, Ava Coleman whispered a single thought to herself, a thought that would shape everything to come. This flight will not end the way she expects. Dinner service had barely begun when the pressure returned, subtle at first, then tightening like a vice. The clink of silverware against porcelain plates should have brought calm to the cabin, a reminder that first class was a sanctuary of comfort. But for Ava and Arya Coleman, every sound seemed muffled under the weight of what had just unfolded. Margaret Whitmore sat across from them, her posture regal, her jaw set with determination. The smug curve of her lips told the story clearly enough. She had not accepted defeat. She was only waiting for her next opportunity to press. The attendants moved through the cabin with polished smiles, balancing trays of filet mignon and seared salmon, but their eyes betrayed them. Kevin Turner avoided looking at the Colemans altogether, his hands trembling slightly as he set down glasses of wine. Ellen Brooks, though more composed, carried a heaviness in her step. She was the veteran, the authority, But Ava could sense the conflict in her. This was no longer just about seating. It was about an airline culture that had always placed certain passengers on pedestals, while asking others to shrink. Arya stabbed her fork into a roasted potato, the scrape of metal sharp enough to make the man across the aisle glance up. "She is going to try again," she muttered. Ava chewed her food slowly before responding. "Of course she is. People like her don't hear no. Not from staff. Not from anyone." Arya shook her head, her voice low but fierce. "I can't keep sitting here letting her spit on us like this. It's like waiting for a snake to strike. You think I don't feel it?" Ava's voice was soft but edged with steel. Every word she says, every look, every smirk, it cuts. But if we lash out now, she wins. Let her keep digging. The deeper she goes, the harder she'll fall. Arya leaned back, crossing her arms. Her sister's patience often felt like a riddle she could never solve, but she trusted her. She always had. Halfway through the meal, Kevin returned. His cheeks were pale, his voice cautious. "Ladies, may I speak with you again?" Arya rolled her eyes. "Let me guess." Another voucher. "A hotel suite in Paris, if we move." Kevin flinched at her sarcasm. He glanced nervously toward Margaret, who pretended not to listen while clearly straining to hear. "It's complicated," he whispered. "Mrs. Whitmore is threatening to file a formal complaint. She said she'll escalate it all the way to corporate. She's demanding that we resolve this now. And by resolve," Arya said flatly, "she means push us out of our seats." Kevin shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to put it that way. But yes, she's insisting. And the truth is—" He hesitated, then blurted out, "Passengers like her are powerful. Complaints from someone at her level can cost jobs." Arya's mouth dropped open, incredulous. "And our comfort, our dignity, our money doesn't matter. We're not powerful enough to be treated fairly." Kevin's face reddened. "I didn't say that. I need you to understand the position I'm in." Ava's voice slipped in, cool and deliberate. "No. What we understand is that you are asking us to surrender what we earned because you are afraid of her, and that is not acceptable." Kevin's lips parted as if to protest, but Ava's steady gaze pinned him. He lowered his eyes, nodding mutely before retreating down the aisle. Margaret chuckled softly to herself, sipping her wine. "See? Even the staff knows how this should end. You're standing in the way of something simple. A wife sitting with her husband. Imagine how selfish that looks." Arya turned toward her sharply. "Selfish. You call us selfish for not letting you take what doesn't belong to you." Margaret smirked. "Sometimes you have to know when to step aside. You wouldn't understand. It's called class." Ava closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to breathe, to steady the storm inside her. She had faced prejudice before, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just the insult, it was the stage. They were enclosed in a cabin with nowhere to go, surrounded by witnesses who sat silently, some uncomfortable, some complicit. Every detail etched itself into memory. Every word was a wound that demanded justice. By the time dessert was served, the air in the cabin was taut with unease. Conversations were hushed. A few passengers scrolled their phones, pretending to disengage while sneaking glances at the standoff. A businessman in 2A whispered something to his wife, shaking his head. The young woman with earbuds had taken them out, her wide eyes flicking between Margaret and the twins. Ellen Brooks finally approached. Her voice was lower now, almost weary. "Miss Coleman, Miss Coleman, I want you to know I respect your position. You have every right to your seats, but Mrs. Whitmore has made it clear she won't stop until this is resolved. I'm asking you, please, consider whether it's worth the disruption to your journey." Arya's jaw dropped. "Are you asking us to make ourselves smaller so she can feel bigger? Do you hear yourself?" Ellen's lips tightened. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight of years in service bore down all at once. "I'm asking you to consider the reality. Some passengers are prioritized." Ava's response was almost a whisper, but it carried more strength than any shout. And that is exactly the problem. For a brief second, Ellen's mask cracked. Her eyes softened, filled with regret. She nodded faintly, as if acknowledging a truth she had long known, but never spoken aloud. Then she straightened, murmuring, "Excuse me," and moved on. Arya leaned toward her sister. "Did you hear that? She admitted it. Prioritize passengers. Like we don't matter." Ava's eyes darkened. "We matter. She just doesn't know it yet." Margaret dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, smugness radiating from her every gesture. "You'll see. At the end of this flight, the airline will choose me. They always do. People like you are temporary. People like me are permanent." The arrogance was breathtaking, but it was also a confession. Ava realized it then. Margaret's sense of superiority wasn't just about seats. It was about a world she believed was fixed in her favor. But the world was shifting, and Margaret was too blind to see it. Arya placed her tablet on the table with a sharp snap, unable to contain her anger any longer. "You want to know the truth, Mrs. Whitmore. We didn't just buy these seats. We built the life that made them possible. We created a company that's changing lives. And tomorrow, in Paris, we're standing on a stage that people like you could never imagine. You think this is about a chair on a plane. It's not. It's about who gets to decide who belongs. And let me tell you something. We belong here more than you ever will." The words reverberated across the cabin. Margaret's smirk faltered for the first time, her eyes narrowing into sharp slits. A few passengers shifted in their seats, discomfort etched across their faces. The businessman in 2A cleared his throat loudly, perhaps to mask his approval. Ava reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it. Her own eyes never left Margaret. Her calm, as always, was not weakness. It was power and reserve, and it was almost time to release it. Margaret, however, leaned back with a cruel smile, her voice dripping with venom. "Enjoy your little moment, girls. It won't last." Arya opened her mouth to respond, but Ava shook her head. "Don't. Not yet." The pressure had mounted to its peak. Margaret had played her hand fully, exposing the rot beneath her entitlement, and though she believed she was winning, Ava and Arya both knew the truth. The storm was ready to break. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants prepared for the overnight portion of the journey. Passengers reclined their seats, tucked into blankets, or scrolled idly through glowing screens. A hush settled over first class, the kind of quiet designed to soothe travelers into slumber. But for Ava and Arya Coleman, there was no peace. They could feel it. The energy coiled like a spring across the aisle. Margaret Whitmore had not surrendered. She was waiting. Ava tried to focus on her tablet, eyes moving across the words of their keynote address, but none of it registered. Every few minutes she glanced up, her gaze falling on the reflection of Margaret's smug face in the darkened window. The woman radiated the kind of self-assurance born of a lifetime spent being obeyed. Ava had met people like her before, but never trapped in a capsule 30,000 feet above the ocean with nowhere to escape. Arya sat rigid, her earbuds in but no music playing. Her eyes flicked from the cabin door to Margaret, restless, waiting for the next strike. She could feel it coming, the way sailors felt storms before they broke. Her knee bounced, her hand clenched and unclenched. Every fiber of her being was braced for impact. It came after dinner trays were cleared, as the attendants dimmed the lights further and whispered good nights to passengers. Margaret leaned forward, her voice carrying clearly in the hush. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, not to her husband, but to the space around her. "First class has become a circus. I spend tens of thousands of dollars a year. And what do I get to sit across from charity cases who think they're equal to me?" The word charity snapped through the air like a whip. Arya yanked out her earbuds, her eyes flashing. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ava raised a hand. Not yet. Ava's breathing slowed, controlled, though she felt her pulse hammering in her temples. Margaret wasn't finished. She shifted in her seat, turning her voice toward Ellen Brooks, who stood nearby monitoring the cabin. "I don't mean to be rude," Margaret said loudly, though her tone was coated in sugar that fooled no one. "But let's be honest. They're probably just here because of a diversity program. Some corporate stunt to make your airline look progressive. Isn't that right?" The words crashed into the cabin like turbulence, jolting everyone from their silence. Even Charles looked up this time, his pen hovering mid-sentence, his mouth tightening. But he didn't speak. Arya exploded. "What did you just say?" Margaret smiled thinly, as though savoring the reaction. "I said you're here because someone thought it would look good for the brochures. 2 young faces, front of the plane, perfect marketing material." She tilted her head, mock sympathy dripping from her voice. "But you and I both know this isn't really your world." Gasps came from across the cabin. The young woman who had been watching earlier covered her mouth with her hand. The businessman shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath. Ellen's spine stiffened, her composure cracking. "That is completely unacceptable," Ellen said sharply, stepping forward. "Mrs. Whitmore." "You cannot," Margaret cut her off with a laugh. "Oh, spare me. Everyone's thinking it. I'm just the one saying it out loud. You think they earned those seats? Please." Ava stood slowly. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, but her presence filled the cabin. Every eye turned toward her. She looked at Margaret, her expression calm but unyielding. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but each word rang like iron. "You don't know who we are. You don't know what we've built. But what you just said—" She paused, her chest rising, her eyes steady. "That wasn't ignorance. That was hate, and we will not let it stand." Margaret rolled her eyes. "Oh, listen to the lecture. Spare me the moral outrage. I've been flying first class since before you were born. You think you're special? You're not. You're just a photo opportunity." Arya shot to her feet beside her sister, her voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to reduce us to a slogan. We worked for these seats. We paid for them. You think you can strip away our worth with a sentence? Not tonight, not ever." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Passengers leaned in, breath held. Ellen stepped closer, her voice commanding now. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am warning you. Another comment like that, and I will escalate this to the captain." Margaret leaned back, her smile icy, her tone dripping with disdain. "Do what you want. I'll escalate higher. I'll make sure every executive in your company hears about how you let loyalty die in favor of theatrics." She waved her hand toward the sisters as if dismissing them. "This little show will cost you dearly." Ava's hands trembled at her sides, but not from fear, from the sheer effort of holding her composure. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaled, then opened them again, sharper, clearer. "You think your money gives you power, but power built on tearing others down always crumbles." Margaret laughed again, high-pitched, brittle. "We'll see." Arya's heart thundered in her chest. She wanted to scream, to rip away every ounce of smugness from Margaret's face. But then she glanced at Ava, and something in her sister's calm steadied her. Ava wasn't suppressing her anger. She was wielding it, saving it, shaping it into something larger. Arya clenched her fists, exhaling slowly. She would follow her sister's lead. Ellen turned toward the sisters, her voice softer now. Miss Coleman, please sit. Let us handle this." Ava shook her head. "With respect. Ms. Brooks, you've tried. She won't stop. This is no longer just about seats. It's about something deeper." Ellen hesitated, her eyes flickering between the calm determination in Ava's face and the smirking defiance in Margaret's. She knew the truth. The Colemans were right, but the machinery of the airline, the culture of appeasing the loudest and richest, pressed against her. Her shoulders sagged. Kevin appeared again, wringing his hands. "Mrs. Brooks, the captain wants an update. He says the disturbance can't continue." His eyes darted nervously toward Margaret. "What should I tell him?" Margaret leaned back smugly, as if victory was already hers. Arya felt the blood rush to her ears. "So this is it. She screams. She insults us. And we're the ones treated like the problem." Kevin stammered, "I didn't mean," Ava cut him off. "Tell the captain the problem is not us. Tell him the problem is a passenger who thinks hate entitles her to special treatment." The words landed like a gavel, final and absolute. Margaret's smugness faltered for the briefest moment. She opened her mouth to retort, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted to Charles, who stared down at his papers as if they could shield him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Every passenger in first class was listening now, no longer pretending otherwise. The quiet wasn't neutrality anymore. It was judgment, pressing down on Margaret like gravity. Ava sat slowly, her body still taut, her voice low but certain. "She thinks she's winning. Let her think it. The real fight hasn't even begun." Arya nodded, her chest still rising and falling with adrenaline. "When it does, we're not backing down." And in that moment, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, the sisters' unity became unshakable. Margaret Whitmore had struck with all the venom she had, laying her prejudice bare for the world to see. What she didn't realize was that she had given Ava and Arya exactly what they needed proof. The storm was no longer gathering. It had broken wide open, and its fallout would not end when the plane landed. The cabin was silent except for the steady hum of engines pushing the aircraft through the night sky. But inside first class, the silence was suffocating, filled with the weight of everything Margaret Whitmore had spewed into the air. No one was sleeping. Not really. Some passengers closed their eyes, but their bodies remained stiff, betraying how alert they were to the storm brewing across the aisle. Arya's chest rose and fell in quick bursts. Her body trembled with energy she couldn't contain. Fury and humiliation colliding inside her like a storm at sea. She whispered to her sister, her voice raw, "I can't take this anymore. I won't." She called us charity cases, diversity hires. She thinks our existence is a prop. If we stay quiet, we're letting her win." Ava's eyes stayed locked on the glowing screen in front of her. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, but the calm carried steel beneath it. "We're not staying quiet. We're choosing the right moment." Arya turned, incredulous. "What moment, Ava?" "She's poisoning the whole cabin with her hate. And everyone is just letting it happen." "Not everyone." Ava's gaze flicked briefly to Ellen Brooks, who stood frozen by the galley, her expression caught between duty and shame. Kevin lingered behind her, pale, guilt written across his face. And the passengers, oh, they were listening, even if they pretended otherwise. "They're witnesses," Ava continued. "The more she talks, the deeper she digs her own grave. When we move, it will be final." Arya pressed her lips together, swallowing the fire in her throat. She had spent her whole life trusting her sister's judgment, even when patience felt like surrender. But tonight the stakes felt higher. The insults had been more vicious, the injustice more public. Still, she nodded, if only because she knew Ava always saw further than she did. Margaret, of course, had no idea that her enemies were strategizing quietly in the seats across from her. She leaned back in her chair, wineglass balanced delicately in her hand, smirking as if she had already won. Her voice drifted again, loud enough to pierce the calm. "You'll see. At the end of this flight, the airline will side with me. It always does. People like me built this world. People like you just borrow from it." The words settled like ash. Arya squeezed her fists until her nails dug into her palms. Ava stared at Margaret for a long, heavy moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached for her phone. Arya blinked. "What are you doing?" Ava's voice was steady, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. "Ending this." Her fingers moved with deliberate precision, scrolling through her contacts. She tapped a number, then pressed the speaker button before placing the phone on the small table between them. The ringing cut through the cabin, clear and sharp. Every passenger's head lifted slightly, curiosity sparking. Margaret raised an eyebrow, amused. "What is this?" "Calling your parents for backup." "How adorable." Arya almost smiled. If only Margaret knew. The phone clicked, and a deep voice answered. "Ova, Arya, you two should be asleep by now. You've got a big day tomorrow." It was warm, familiar, tinged with paternal affection, but beneath it was a cadence that commanded attention, a voice honed in boardrooms and negotiations. "Hi, Dad," Ava said, her calm finally giving way to a tremor. "I'm sorry to call you, but we have a situation." Richard Coleman's tone sharpened instantly. "What happened?" Arya leaned toward the phone, her voice quivering with suppressed anger. "We're in first class. A woman here has been demanding that we give up our seats so she can sit with her husband. She said we don't belong here. She called us diversity tokens." Arya's voice cracked. "She called us charity cases." There was a pause on the other end, heavy and dangerous, the kind of pause that meant consequences were being measured in real time. Then Richard's voice came, low and precise. "Put me on speaker." The phone was already there, but Ava adjusted it slightly, her fingers brushing the cool glass. "You're on? Who am I speaking to?" Richard's voice filled the cabin, strong, resonant, impossible to ignore. Ellen Brooks froze mid-step. Kevin stopped breathing. Passengers sat straighter in their seats. Even Margaret, who had smirked moments before, faltered as the weight of his tone settled over the space. Ava answered. This is Ellen Brooks, senior flight attendant, and this is Margaret Whitmore, passenger in 1C. Margaret laughed lightly, though her voice carried a tremor she hadn't intended. So this is Daddy. Really calling in reinforcements. How childish. Richard's reply was ice. Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Richard Coleman. I am the controlling shareholder of Aurora Airlines, and you have just insulted my daughters on one of my planes. The gasp that swept through the cabin was audible, a collective intake of breath as realization spread. Passengers who had been silent witnesses suddenly leaned in, their eyes wide. Kevin gripped the back of a seat to steady himself. Ellen's jaw dropped before she quickly composed herself, her face flushing. Margaret's eyes widened, her confidence faltering for the first time. She searched her husband's face for support, but Charles was staring at his shoes, color drained from his cheeks. You can't be serious," Margaret stammered. Richard's voice did not rise, but every syllable was weighted with authority. "I am entirely serious. I heard every word my daughters just repeated. And now the entire cabin has heard it too. You humiliated them publicly. You attempted to rob them of the dignity they have earned. And you did it under the assumption that your loyalty status and your arrogance entitled you to more than them." Margaret opened her mouth to object, but Richard's voice thundered on. "Let me be clear. That ends now." The words struck like hammer blows. Ellen stepped forward, addressing the phone with newfound urgency. "Mr. Coleman, this is Ellen Brooks. I tried to de-escalate. I informed Mrs. Whitmore that the Coleman seats were confirmed." Richard cut her off, though his tone softened slightly. "Ms. Brooks, I heard you tried, and I respect that. But this goes beyond one flight. This is about culture. This is about who we value. I will be speaking directly with Daniel Jang when this flight lands, and we will be making changes." Kevin nearly collapsed into his seat at the mention of the CEO's name. Margaret's face drained of color completely. You don't have the right," she sputtered. Richard's voice sliced through her objection. "I don't have the right, Mrs. Whitmore. I own the right. I own this airline. And you, madam, will never step foot in one of its first-class cabins again." The words landed like a verdict. Passengers exchanged glances, their shock giving way to murmurs of approval. Some even allowed small smiles to flicker across their faces, satisfaction at seeing arrogance toppled. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. For once, the endless stream of entitlement had dried up. Richard's tone softened as he addressed his daughters again. "Ava, Aria, I am sorry. This is not what I built Aurora Airlines to be. You deserve better. You will always deserve better. I am proud of you both. Sit tall, sit strong, and know that this fight is already won." Tears stung Aria's eyes. Ava's throat tightened, but she swallowed hard, holding her composure. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. The call ended with a soft click, but the silence it left behind was louder than any engine roar. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely. The Colemans were no longer passengers being harassed. They were symbols of a reckoning. Margaret was no longer the queen of the aisle. She was a woman stripped bare, her entitlement exposed, her arrogance dismantled. Aria leaned back in her seat, exhaling for the first time since boarding. Ava reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Across the aisle, Margaret sat frozen, pale, her wineglass trembling in her grip. Her husband's silence was louder than her outrage had ever been, and the rest of the passengers. They would never forget what they had just witnessed. The silence that followed Richard Coleman's voice was thick enough to choke on. The plane surged steadily across the Atlantic, but inside first-class time seemed to have stopped. Every passenger stared, some openly, some from the corners of their eyes, as if reluctant to be caught gawking at the fallout of a public reckoning. Margaret Whitmore sat frozen in her seat, pale as porcelain, her lips parted but useless. The woman who had filled the cabin with venom only minutes earlier now looked small, almost shrunken. Her husband, Charles, shifted uncomfortably, his face drawn tight with shame. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say a word. He only stared at the leather stitching of his seat as if it could shield him from the humiliation pressing down on them both. Ellen Brooks stood with her hands clasped at her waist, her posture straight but her eyes wide. For decades, she had managed entitled passengers, smoothing conflicts and swallowing insults in the name of service. But this was different. This wasn't appeasement or compromise. This was justice, delivered with surgical precision. She glanced at the sisters, Ava calm and composed, Aria trembling with adrenaline, and felt something shift inside herself. She had seen strength in passengers before, but never like this. Kevin Turner lingered behind her, his face drained of color. He looked like someone who had just watched his career flash before his eyes. He swallowed hard, remembering every moment he had tried to coax the sisters into moving, every clumsy attempt to appease Margaret. The shame burned, heavy and hot. Aria leaned back against her seat, the tension finally breaking from her shoulders. Her chest rose and fell in sharp breaths, as if she had been holding them all flight. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her father's words replay in her mind like an anchor. Sit tall, sit strong. This fight is already won. She whispered it under her breath. And for the first time since boarding, she believed it. Ava, still composed, turned her gaze across the aisle. Margaret was watching her, eyes wide, mouth trembling. There was no arrogance left, no smug smile, only the hollow look of someone who realized the ground beneath her feet had collapsed. Ava did not speak. She did not gloat. She only held Margaret's gaze until the woman turned away, cheeks flushing crimson. The rest of the passengers stirred uncomfortably in their seats. For hours they had been silent, complicit in their stillness, hoping to ride out the storm without becoming part of it. But now the silence felt heavier, laced with guilt. The young woman near the window pulled out her earbuds and whispered to her companion. "Did you hear what her father said? He owns the airline." The businessman in 2A let out a low whistle. "That's going to cost her more than she realizes," he muttered. Ava caught their words, but she didn't react. She didn't need to. The murmurs spreading through the cabin told her everything she needed to know. Margaret's kingdom of entitlement had crumbled, and everyone had witnessed it. Ellen stepped forward, her voice quieter than usual, carrying an unusual tremor. Miss Coleman," she said carefully. "I want to apologize. This should never have escalated this far. You were right to hold your ground. And she paused, searching for the words. "I should have been firmer sooner." Ava's face softened slightly. "You tried, Ms. Brooks, but you've been trained to prioritize people like her." Ellen inhaled sharply, her throat tightening. "She knew it was true. Not anymore," she whispered. Margaret snapped her head up, her voice cracking. "You can't just decide I don't belong here. I am a platinum customer." Her words faltered as she caught sight of Ellen's face. There was no deference there anymore. No polite appeasement. only cold professionalism. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ellen said, her voice steady now. "Please lower your voice. Any further disruption will be reported directly to the captain. And, as you heard, Mr. Coleman has already made it clear where this airline stands." Margaret's cheeks flamed red. Her fingers dug into the armrest of her seat. For the first time in her life of commanding, demanding, and receiving, she had no leverage left. She turned to her husband, desperate. "Charles, say something." But Charles did not look at her. His jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed firmly on the window. He muttered only 2 words, barely audible. "Not now." The rejection landed harder than Richard Coleman's verdict. Margaret slumped back against her seat, her eyes darting across the cabin as if searching for an ally. There were none. Every passenger she looked at turned away quickly, unwilling to meet her gaze. Arya watched it unfold. The fall of a woman who had strutted across the aisle only hours ago, drunk on entitlement. She felt a rush of grim satisfaction, yet mixed with it was exhaustion, a heaviness that made her bones ache. She turned to Ava. "It's over," she whispered. Ava shook her head slowly. "Not yet. This is just the beginning." Kevin shifted closer, his voice low, cracking with nerves. "What happens now?" Ellen's answer was crisp. "Now, we finish the flight. No more interruptions, no more drama, and when we land, corporate will take it from there." She looked directly at Ava and Arya, her tone softening again. "I will personally escort you off the plane when we arrive. You won't have to deal with anything further." Arya exhaled, leaning her head back against the headrest. "Thank you," she murmured. The rest of the flight settled into an uneasy calm. The attendants resumed service, though their movements were quieter, their eyes constantly flicking toward the Colemans and Margaret. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their voices carrying the thrill of gossip, but no one dared disrupt the silence. Margaret remained stiff in her seat, her hands clenched in her lap. She sipped at her wine, but the glass trembled against her lips. She no longer looked powerful. She looked cornered, and she knew it. Hours later, as the cabin darkened fully and the plane soared through the night, Arya whispered to Ava, her voice low, tinged with disbelief. "Do you think she'll ever understand what she did?" Ava shook her head. "People like her don't learn by understanding. They learn by consequences." Arya let the words sink in, her eyes drifting to Margaret's rigid silhouette. She thought of every insult, every smirk, every attempt to make them small, and she realized Ava was right. Margaret's lesson would not come from reflection. It would come from everything that followed this flight. As the plane crossed silently over the Atlantic, the weight of justice already hovered in the air, waiting to descend. The wheels touched down in Paris with a soft jolt, the landing smooth, but the tension in first class anything but. Passengers stirred awake, stretching stiff limbs, collecting belongings. But the usual quiet excitement of arrival was absent. Instead, an unspoken awareness lingered in the cabin. They had all witnessed something historic. Margaret Whitmore sat stiff in her seat, her eyes bloodshot, her lips pressed in a tight line. She had barely spoken since Richard Coleman's voice had filled the cabin hours earlier. Charles sat beside her in silence, his face drawn, his jaw clenched. He had not defended her. He could not defend her. Ava and Arya Coleman gathered their things with unhurried calm. Their movements were precise, deliberate. They had faced venom at 30,000 feet and had refused to shrink. The hum of empowerment still pulsed quietly between them, even as fatigue weighed heavy on their shoulders. Ellen Brooks appeared at their side as passengers stood to retrieve luggage. "Miss Coleman, Miss Coleman," she said softly. "Please wait until the others disembark. I'll escort you out personally." Arya raised an eyebrow. "Because of her." She glanced at Margaret, who sat hunched in her seat. Ellen's eyes flickered briefly in that direction before returning to the sisters. "Because you deserve respect," she answered. "For the first time since boarding." Arya smiled faintly. The Colemans remained seated as passengers filed past. Some avoided their gaze, embarrassed by their silence during the ordeal. Others offered small, supportive nods, gestures of quiet solidarity. One man murmured, "Good for you," as he passed, but his eyes never met theirs directly. When the cabin was nearly empty, Ellen led Ava and Arya down the aisle. The plane smelled faintly of brewed coffee and recycled air, but beneath it was the electric hum of something larger. Change. At the gate, two sharply dressed Aurora Airlines officials waited, their faces grave. One introduced himself as Michael Tran, Director of Customer Operations. The other, Maria Gomez, was head of public relations. Their presence was not casual. They were here because Richard Coleman's phone call had reached the highest levels overnight. "Miss Coleman, Miss Coleman," Michael said, his tone respectful, almost deferential. "We are so sorry for everything you endured on your flight. Mr. Coleman has already spoken with the board. We'll be launching a full review immediately." Arya crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "And what does that mean? A memo? A half-hearted training session? A month from now, another Margaret will stand in front of someone else and do the same thing." Maria Gomez winced, knowing the accusation was fair. "No," she said carefully, "this won't be swept aside. What happened wasn't just an isolated passenger being rude. It revealed a deeper problem: how our staff are trained, who we empower, who we silence. That is going to change." Ava studied the woman's face. "Because you want it to, or because my father will make you?" Maria paused. Her eyes softened. "Both," she admitted. "Your father's words made it unavoidable. But the truth is, this should have changed long ago. And you're right to demand more than promises." Arya exhaled, shaking her head. "We didn't ask for this fight. We wanted a flight. That's all. And instead we had to defend our right to exist in seats we paid for." Michael's voice lowered. "And because you did, the entire airline is about to face its reflection. Mr. Zhang has already called an emergency board meeting in Paris. He wants you both there, if you're willing." Arya blinked. At the board meeting, Ava's lips curved into the faintest smile. "He wants us to speak." Maria nodded. "To tell the story in your own words. To make sure what happened here never happens again." The weight of the moment settled on the sisters. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about every flight, every lounge, every moment when silence had covered prejudice. They were no longer passengers. They were witnesses. They were catalysts. Hours later, in a sleek glass-walled conference room overlooking the Paris skyline, Aurora Airlines top executives gathered. The mood was tense, a mixture of embarrassment and urgency. Daniel Zhang, the CEO, sat at the head of the long table, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "last night, on Flight 208, something unacceptable happened. Two of our passengers, confirmed and ticketed, were asked to give up their seats, not because of logistics, not because of safety, but because of arrogance. And when they refused, they were subjected to insults that should sicken every one of us. He gestured toward Ava and Arya, seated at the far end of the table. Every head turned. The twins felt the weight of a dozen powerful gazes, but they did not flinch. "I've asked the Colemans to tell us what happened," Jean continued. "Not the sanitized report. The truth." Arya leaned forward, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. She told them everything: the entitlement, the demands, the smirks, the words charity cases, diversity tokens, not belonging. Her voice cracked once, but she did not stop. She painted the scene in vivid strokes, the way Margaret's venom had filled the cabin, how the staff had hesitated, how silence had protected prejudice. Ava followed, her tone calmer but sharper. This wasn't about one passenger. It was about a culture that tells staff to protect loyalty members at all costs, a culture that makes people like us expendable, even when we've paid, even when we've earned our place. That culture has consequences, and last night, everyone saw them. The room was silent when she finished. Executives shifted in their seats, some ashamed, some thoughtful. Daniel Zhang's expression did not change, but his eyes burned brighter. "Thank you," he said finally. "You've given us what we needed. Not excuses, not spin, the truth. And I promise you this Aurora Airlines will not look the same after today." He turned to the board. "Effective immediately, I am commissioning a full overhaul of our customer service policies. No more blind appeasement of loyalty members at the expense of fairness. No more silencing dignity to protect dollars. Every passenger will be treated with equal respect. No exceptions." An executive at the table cleared his throat nervously, and the Whitmore's Zhang's reply was swift. "Mrs. Whitmore's platinum status has been revoked permanently. She is banned from our first-class cabins. As for Mr. Whitmore's law firm, our legal team will draft termination letters today. They will learn that prejudice costs more than loyalty earns." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Zhang raised his hand, silencing it. "This is not about revenge. This is about integrity. And if that costs us contracts, so be it." He turned back to Ava and Arya. "You didn't choose this fight, but you won it. And because of you, millions of passengers who look like you or don't look like Margaret Whitmore will step onto our planes tomorrow knowing they belong. That is no small thing." Arya's throat tightened. She glanced at Ava, who gave her a small, steady nod. They had come to Paris to speak about technology, about innovation. Instead, they had become symbols of something bigger. Ava's voice was quiet, but certain. "Then make sure this change lasts longer than our flight." Daniel Zhang inclined his head. "It will." As the meeting adjourned, the weight of history lingered in the air. The Colemans walked out into the bright Paris sunlight, exhausted but resolute. The fight had followed them across the ocean, and now it had reshaped an entire company. And somewhere in a quiet hotel across the city, Margaret Whitmore sat alone, realizing her empire of entitlement had not just cracked, it had collapsed. Back in London, word of the confrontation aboard Aurora Flight 208 traveled faster than the jet that carried it. By the time Margaret and Charles Whitmore reached their suite at the Clarendon Hotel, the story had already begun to leak. Executives, journalists, even whispers among socialites, everyone seemed to know that something explosive had unfolded mid-air. Margaret stormed into the room, tossing her handbag onto the bed. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with indignation. "Did you hear the way he spoke to me?" she hissed, pacing back and forth. "Richard Coleman, acting like a king because he owns some shares in the airline, humiliating me in front of strangers. Charles closed the door behind them slowly, his jaw tight. He loosened his tie, his movements controlled, deliberate. He did not answer immediately. His silence was not indifference. It was fury held in check. Margaret spun toward him. "Say something." "You just sat there. You let him talk to me like that. You let them all look at me like I was nothing." Charles raised his eyes, cold and sharp. "You made yourself look like nothing. Margaret, I didn't have to help." The words sliced through her. She recoiled as if struck. "How dare you? How dare I?" His voice rose, years of restraint unraveling. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That was Richard Coleman, the man whose conglomerate controls half our firm's client base. You didn't just pick a fight with his daughters. You insulted them in public. You called them tokens, charity cases, and you did it on his airline. Do you understand what that means?" Margaret blinked, her indignation faltering. It was just words. People talk. It will blow over. Charles laughed bitterly, a sound stripped of humor. "Blow over, Margaret. The board of Sullivan and Hawthorne called me this morning. They already know. Coleman is terminating every contract with us. $15 million a year in billings gone. Do you realize what kind of black mark that is? My name is mud. My career is finished." Margaret's face paled. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for words. "They wouldn't. They can't punish you for what I said." "They can, and they have." Charles sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The managing partner made it very clear. "I either resign quietly with a gag order, or they vote me out and make it public. 30 years. Margaret, 30 years I gave that firm. All of it gone because you couldn't stand the thought of 2 young black women sitting in front of you on a plane." The room fell silent except for Margaret's shallow breathing. Her indignation curdled into something closer to panic. "You're exaggerating. You're blaming me because you were weak. You should have defended yourself. You should have defended me." Charles's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "Defend you? You dragged me into your arrogance. You used my name as a weapon, thinking it would shield you. Instead, it destroyed us both." His voice broke, raw with despair. "Do you even hear yourself? You still think you're the victim. You humiliated yourself, Margaret, and you humiliated me." Her hands shook. She reached for her wineglass on the table, filling it to the brim with trembling fingers. She downed half of it in a single gulp. "So what now?" she whispered, her voice small for the first time. "What happens to us, todos?" Charles leaned back in the chair, exhaustion etching lines across his face. "We're ruined. That's what happens. The contracts are gone. The reputation is gone. The invitations will stop. The clubs will close their doors. Everything we built, everything we flaunted, it's over." Margaret stared at him, her eyes wide, her lips quivering. She had always been the one in control, the one who could bend rules and people to her will. For the first time, she saw the truth. Her entitlement had not elevated her. It had hollowed her life, leaving nothing to stand on when the world finally pushed back. The following days only deepened the spiral. Gossip columns in London and New York hinted at an incident involving a prominent socialite. Anonymous leaks from passengers painted an unflattering picture, a woman demanding special treatment, hurling insults, silenced only when a powerful executive intervened. Her name was not printed yet, but those in the right circles already knew, and they whispered. Margaret tried to attend a charity luncheon 3 days later. clinging to the routine of her old life. But as soon as she entered the gilded hall, conversations dimmed, faces turned, smiles tightened. The whispers swelled like static. She lasted 20 minutes before fleeing, her cheeks burning, her hands trembling as she hailed a car in the rain. Charles, meanwhile, resigned his partnership. The firm issued a bland statement thanking him for his years of service, but everyone knew the truth. Behind closed doors, colleagues avoided his eye. Friends stopped calling. The phone, once alive with invitations, was silent. At night, the couple sat in silence at their sprawling estate outside the city. Margaret drank heavily, replaying the flight in her mind, twisting it into a story where she was still the wrong party. Charles avoided her gaze, bitterness radiating from him. Their marriage, already built on appearances more than intimacy, now cracked under the weight of shared ruin. One evening, after a long silence, Charles spoke without looking at her. "Do you realize what image haunts me?" Margaret's head tilted. What he turned, his eyes hollow. Those two young women, the way they looked at you after you called them tokens, calm, unmoved, stronger than you'll ever be. That's what I see when I close my eyes. Not your humiliation, theirs, because you tried to strip them of their dignity, and they refused to let you. Do you understand how pathetic that makes you look? Margaret's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, she had no defense. Charles stood, walking toward the door. "We lost everything because you couldn't accept that they belonged. And the truth is, Margaret, they belong more than we ever did." He left the room, the echo of his words hanging in the air like a final sentence. Margaret sat alone, staring into the dark, clutching her glass of wine with shaking hands. For the first time in her life, she felt what she had always feared most. Not exclusion, not insult, irrelevance. The morning light spilled over Paris, casting golden streaks across the Seine and painting the rooftops with quiet brilliance. Ava and Aria Coleman stood at the tall windows of their hotel suite, watching the city awaken. Their bodies were heavy with exhaustion, but beneath the fatigue lay something sharper, something unshakable. Today was the day they had crossed an ocean for the Global Innovators Summit. Their names were printed in glossy programs, their faces displayed on banners outside the Palais des Congrès. They were no longer just entrepreneurs from New York. They were keynote speakers on one of the world's biggest stages. Yet even as the weight of their achievement filled the air, the shadow of what had happened aboard Aurora Flight 208 lingered. Aria traced her reflection in the window, her brow furrowed. "What if people already know?" she asked quietly. "What if word spreads before we even step on stage? What if they see us not for our work, but for what she called us?" Ava turned, her calm a steady anchor. "Then let them. If they see us as charity cases, we'll show them the truth. If they see us as tokens, we'll prove we're more than they can handle." What happened on that plane wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning. Aria's lips pressed into a line, but her eyes softened. She had always trusted her sister's foresight, and today she clung to it. When they arrived at the venue, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The lobby was alive with voices in dozens of languages, entrepreneurs mingling with investors, journalists weaving between conversations with recorders in hand. Giant banners hung from the ceiling with the summit's theme in bold letters. "The future belongs to all." The irony was not lost on either of them. Backstage, they reviewed their notes one last time. Their presentation wasn't just about technology. It was about kismet, their financial literacy platform for underserved communities. It was about empowerment, access, and breaking cycles of exclusion. As they rehearsed quietly, a stage manager peeked in. 5 minutes, he said. Arya's palms were slick. Her chest rose and fell too quickly. Ava touched her shoulder. Remember, they need us more than we need them. We are the story, not her. The words steadied her like a tether. When they walked onto the stage, applause greeted them, polite at first, then swelling as the audience recognized them. Cameras flashed. The stage lights were hot, but they stood tall, side by side, their presence commanding. Ava began, her voice smooth, carrying across the hall. Good morning. My sister and I grew up in a neighborhood where money was always a shadow, where opportunity was something you heard about, but rarely touched. We built Kismet because we believe financial literacy should not be a privilege. It should be a right. Arya took over seamlessly, her energy a contrast to Ava's calm. For too long, the system has told certain people they don't belong. That wealth, stability, power, it isn't for them. We built our platform to dismantle that lie, to say you do belong, you always did. The words struck the audience like lightning. Heads nodded, pens scribbled, phones recorded. What had begun as a keynote became something more, a manifesto. Halfway through, Arya's voice faltered just slightly. She glanced at Ava, a flicker of the night before flashing across her face. Ava caught it instantly. Without missing a beat, she leaned closer to the microphone. And let me tell you something personal. Last night, on our way here, someone told us we didn't belong. They told us we were tokens, that our place in the front of the plane was charity. The audience stilled. Every ear sharpened. But here we are, Ava continued, her tone steel wrapped in silk. Not tokens, not charity. Innovators, builders, women who belong not just in seats on a plane, but in seats of power, and we will not let anyone tell us otherwise. The applause was thunderous, rising like a wave and crashing across the hall. Arya's chest swelled, her fire reignited. She stepped forward, her voice fierce. And neither should you. Whatever seat you've been told you don't deserve, take it. Sit tall, sit strong. You belong. The ovation rose again, louder, longer. Some stood, some cheered. The energy was electric, a tide turning in real time. By the time they finished, the audience was on its feet, clapping until their hands ached. Reporters swarmed backstage, investors pushed for meetings, and young entrepreneurs lined up just to shake their hands. One journalist, notebook trembling in his grip, asked softly, "Was that true? What happened on your flight?" Ava's expression was serene. "Yes," she said simply. "But what matters more is what happened after. We chose not to be silent," Arya added, her voice like fire catching wind. "And silence is how injustice survives. We won't let it." The headlines the next morning were not just about their company. They were about their courage. Sisters turned prejudice into power at Global Summit. Coleman twins redefined belonging. From humiliation to inspiration. A story for the world. But beyond the press, something deeper stirred. Emails poured into their inbox. Messages from women across the globe. Entrepreneurs, students, flight attendants, mothers. Each one carried the same sentiment. Because of you, I believe I belong too. That night, as they sat together in their hotel room overlooking the glittering Eiffel Tower, Arya scrolled through the messages with tears in her eyes. "Do you think Dad knows what we did today?" Ava smiled softly. watching the city lights. Of course he does. He's always known. Arya leaned her head on her sister's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up. But this time, it was not heavy with fear. It was heavy with triumph. They had come to Paris to speak about innovation. They had ended up telling the world about dignity. And in doing so, they had turned the ugliest moment of their journey into the brightest light of their careers. Paris glowed like a promise the night the news broke. Not gossip this time. Not whispers traded in hushed hotel lobbies. Real news. Aurora Airlines announced sweeping reforms at a press conference streamed to every hub in its network. The video began with Daniel Zhang at a clear podium, the city skyline behind him, his voice steady and unmistakably firm. He spoke of equal dignity for every passenger. He spoke of the cost of appeasing arrogance. He spoke of two sisters who refused to give up what they had earned. And then he did something rarer than any corporate slogan. He named the problem, not as a one-off embarrassment, but as a culture that must be rebuilt. The plan was specific. New training written not as a box to check, but as a standard to live by. A hotline for employees and passengers to report bias without fear. An independent council to review complaints. A ranking for stations and cabins that rewarded fairness as much as punctuality. And one last line that made headlines around the world. First class is not a birthright, it is a contract. Honor it or lose it. The press leaned forward, cameras clicked, analysts scribbled questions, but the moment that traveled fastest came next. The screen behind Zhang switched to a short film. No narration, just images. A cabin bathed in warm light. Two young women side by side. Laptops open. Faces focused and calm. Service that felt human rather than performative. A closing title on a black screen. The future belongs at the front to everyone who earns the seat. Back at the hotel, Ava and Arya watched in silence. The footage was not them, and that felt right. It was not about faces to sell tickets. It was about a standard. Arya exhaled, something like relief crossing her features. Ava reached for the remote and muted the screen. The room settled into a quiet that felt deserved. It did not erase what had happened. It honored it by choosing what would happen next. The next morning, an email arrived from Zhang's office with a simple invitation. Help us build this for real. Ellen Brooks would lead a new academy for service culture. She had asked for the assignment. She would write the curriculum with a small team pulled from across the network. People who had kept their composure when it was hardest. People who remembered what it felt like to be small in a space designed to make others feel large. There was a chair for Kevin Turner, too. Not as a punishment, but as a test. Learn, listen, teach. Earn your way back by helping others avoid your mistake. Ava read the note twice. She thought of Ellen's face on the plane, the moment a practiced mask cracked and conscience stepped through. She thought of Kevin's hands, trembling and young, and of the world that had trained him to protect status first and dignity second. Then she typed the only answer that made sense. Yes, we will help. But it must be more than a binder and a video. It must be a habit. The habit began where habits always begin, with language. The academy taught greetings that were sincere and neutral. It taught questions that opened doors rather than closed cases. It taught the difference between offering a choice and applying pressure. It taught the courage to say no to the loudest voice in the room when no was the right answer. The sessions did not flinch from the hard moments. They played the scenario from Flight 208, word for word, using actors. The room stayed quiet through the worst lines. No one rushed to excuse them. When the lights came up, Ellen did not ask, "How do you feel?" She asked, "What would you do next time?" Then she waited until someone answered in a way that made the others sit a little taller. A month later, Aurora launched a fellowship named for the value the Colemans had defended. The Belonging Fellowship, grants for founders from communities the capital markets rarely visit, workspace and mentorship, a promise to put their prototypes in the hands of real customers before an investor ever asked for a deck. The first cohort gathered in a sunlit room at the airline's headquarters. Ava and Arya stood at the front with a whiteboard and no prepared speech. They told the truth instead. Your product matters. Your dignity matters more. Protect both. Build the thing only you can build. When someone asks whether you belong, say it once, and then show them for the next 10 years. The story reached places the sisters had never imagined. A public school teacher in Detroit played their keynote to a class of seniors and asked them to write letters to their future selves about the seat they refused to give up. A flight attendant in Manila sent a photograph of a crew huddled in a galley after a long flight, smiling through tired eyes, holding up a handmade sign that read, "We choose dignity." A grandmother in Lagos wrote a note in careful cursive, "I do not fly, but I know a front row when I see one. You sit there for all of us. One evening in New York, weeks after Paris." Ava and Arya walked past a billboard they had not known about. Not a glossy ad with perfect hair and impossible lighting. A simple photograph shot in warm light of two first-class seats beside each other. One had a book resting on the arm. The other had a laptop open to a page of notes. No faces, no models. A single line at the bottom. Earned seats. Shared skies. Arya stopped on the sidewalk and stared up at it. She did not cry, though she felt close. Ava slipped her hand into her sister's and squeezed once. "It is not our picture," Arya said. "It still feels like us." Ava nodded. "It feels like everyone. And the Whitmores. There is a temptation in stories like this to make the ending simple, to declare villains vanquished and heroes crowned. Life rarely cooperates. The fallout for Margaret and Charles was not cinematic. It was slow. The calls did not return. The invitations did not arrive. The days grew quiet and then long. Charles found work again, not at the level he had once claimed. And perhaps that was a mercy. Without the scaffolding of prestige, he discovered he could be decent without applause. He kept to himself. He did not defend what had happened. When asked, he used few words. "I failed to speak when it mattered. I am trying to do better now." Margaret tried to outpace the story. She changed clubs, stylists, even cities for a time. But reinvention without reflection is only costume. In a moment, she did not plan. She walked into a bookstore on a rainy afternoon and found herself standing in front of a display with a magazine cover showing two sisters at a conference stage. She stared at the photo for a long time, longer than she would have admitted. Something in her face softened, then hardened again. She bought nothing and left quickly, but the image stayed with her on the ride home. Sometimes accountability comes like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a mirror. Richard Coleman did what powerful people often promise and rarely deliver. He stepped back. He declined interviews. He let the airline's leaders lead. He took more calls from Ava and Ara that had nothing to do with planes, food, books, the tiny facts that make a life. When the fellowship announced in second cohort, he sat in the back row and listened, proud and quiet, clapping for founders he had not handpicked and did not need to control. He had made the call heard around the cabin. Now he learned the discipline of silence. On a crisp autumn evening, the sisters returned to JFK for another flight to Europe. The terminal looked the same, smelled the same, hummed the same, but it felt different to them. That may have been memory. It may also have been the way a gate agent greeted an older couple with the same warmth she had offered a frequent flyer in a suit. Ellen met them at the door of the aircraft, her eyes bright, her posture lighter than the day they had met. "Training is not a cure," she said softly. "It is practice. We keep practicing." Kevin walked up behind her, a notebook tucked under his arm, a shy resolve in his face. "I wanted to say thank you. I am better at my job now. I think I am better at being a person, too." They took their seats in the front row, not for the symbolism, for the legroom and the quiet and the long work ahead. Arya set her bag under the seat and looked sideways at her sister. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked. Ava adjusted the reading light and smiled. "No. We get stronger. That is different." The plane lifted into the night. The cabin lights dimmed. Across the aisle, a young father rocked a baby and whispered a lullaby off-key. In the row behind them, a student highlighted a textbook, lips moving as he rehearsed. A flight attendant tucked a blanket around an elderly woman with a tenderness that looked like a secret. This was the world they wanted. Not perfect. Practiced. Somewhere between New York and the dawn. Ava closed her eyes and let her breath fall into the gentle rhythm of the engines. Arya watched the moving map on the screen as their tiny plane icon crept over the ocean. She thought of the girl who had once sat at the back of a classroom and learned how to want more. She thought of the woman who had told her she did not belong at the front of a plane. She thought of the stage in Paris, and the quiet after applause when all that remained was work. Then she reached over and laced her fingers through her sister's. The habit of their lives. The promise of their future. When the wheels touched down, the light through the window was pale and kind. The sisters gathered their bags and stepped into the aisle. No one whispered that they should go to the back. No one asked them to move. It should have been ordinary. It felt like a ceremony. A seat on a plane is not a throne. It is not a certificate of virtue. It is a promise between a traveler and a company that the journey will be fair. Keep the promise, and the skies belong to all of us. Break it, and the story will find you. Somewhere in the world, a billboard stood with 2 empty seats photographed in warm light. Earned seats, shared skies. The picture never showed faces. That was the point. The story was never only about who sat there once. It was about who gets to sit there next. The plane lands. The echo remains. A seat is only leather and steel, but the way we treat one another gives it meaning. Ava and Arya chose calm over fury, resolve over retreat. Their strength did not humiliate an enemy. It invited a world to do better. We saw a father speak with clarity, an airline choose integrity, and a culture take one step toward belonging. We also saw how cruel words travel, how silence can wound, and how accountability can clear the air like rain. Let this be our promise. We will honor the people beside us. We will defend the right to be seen. We will say no to the small, sharp habits of discrimination, and yes to the everyday courage that turns strangers into neighbors. If this story touched your heart, hold it, share it. Talk about it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity is non-negotiable. Thank you for watching and for feeling this with us. To keep these voices alive, please like, share, and subscribe. More true stories are coming. Stay with us for the next chapter.